Hey everybody, Jonathan Fields with Good Life Project. So my guest today is artist and illustrator Lisa Condon. I'm exploring not only her creative process and her sort of the things that she does in the art world and the business world, and also her journey and sort of like what she went through to get here. So it's awesome to be hanging out with you today.
It's great to have you here.
We are hanging out in your studio in San Francisco, and there's this vibe here that just kind of makes me want to start moving my hands. I want to touch stuff, I want to create stuff. Just tell me a little bit about the environment that we're in. I'm curious about it.
Well, I'm one of those people who likes to surround herself with things that are like visually interesting and beautiful, at least to me. Mm-hmm. I've always been like that. I was like that when I was a little girl in my bedroom, you know. My mom would say, go clean your room, and I would say, okay. And I'd go in there and I'd arrange things and tack things to the wall. I wouldn't necessarily clean or make my bed, but they were just, you know, I've always been about, you know, creating a space that is inspiring to me.
Even when you were a kid?
Even when I was a kid. And so it feels really awesome to be in this space that has 4 white walls, you know, that I can kind of use to pin up my inspiration and my artwork that I'm, you know, working on or have finished, and then other, you know, stuff. I'm an avid collector of old, unusual things, and I've got a lot of those around here too. Right. So, I don't know. I just like to surround myself by inspiring things. I think some artists like to, like to surround themselves with nothing,
right.
you know, and have these minimalist spaces.
Opposite extreme, where it's just it's pure white.
Yeah, and I think I get that to a certain degree, but for me, this is what kind of. Like I come in here and I feel happy. It's filled with stuff that I love. So.
I love that. And I guess that's partly an outgrowth of what you do now also with the collections that you put together. So you've taken that and turned sort of like this just personal orientation about how you like things in the world and said, okay, there's something bigger.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about how what your collections are and how that whole thing came to life.
I've been a collector, not of all the same stuff I have now, but of stuff in general since I was a kid. You know, when I was a kid, it was things like, you know, I had a penguin collection, which was like figurines and stuffed animals, and I had a doll collection, but I've always sort of had this tendency, I think there's a collector's gene in some people, and I've always had a tendency to like make collections. And so when I was in my 20s, I started collecting like vintage ephemera and just old things. I'm really drawn to things that are old and have had another life before me. And, you know, everything from old school supplies to old letters and anything that has like a worn look to it or shows some age. I love vintage typography and, you know, vintage books. And so over the years, I've amassed a lot of stuff, as you can imagine. And I got this idea in 2009 that I wanted to do a project, and at the time I didn't know if it was going to have anything to do with my collections, but I wanted to do an internet project where I posted an image of something every day, and I wanted it to be separate from my regular art practice. So I didn't want it to be drawings or paintings or anything like that. I wanted it to be something different that would sort of pull me out of that. And so I got this idea that I would do this project called A Collection a Day, where every day for 365 days for the year of 2010, I would photograph one or part of one of my collections every day and post it on this blog.
Was this stuff you had already collected?
Yeah,
or were you
for the most part.
actively?
I mean, once the project got going and people really responded to the photographs that I was taking and posting, I realized that I was onto something. And, you know, pretty quickly, within a few months, I got a book deal. So it was like, oh, people are paying attention to this. I can't just post, flashcards every day.
Right, so you're probably thinking, oh, I need to up my game. These vintage are really good.
Or like, vintage pencils. So I started shopping midway through the year I would go to flea markets and look for anything that was in a Ziploc bag, because I thought, well, there's got to be more than one of it, you know. Right. So there was stuff that I normally would never have collected, like fishing lures, and, you know, there's one that's been really popular that's like plastic baby doll hands, you know, stuff like that, but that I knew would make a really great photo.
So with stuff like that, like, did you have any sense before that went up that would be a thing that would get really popular?
What, the project itself?
No, the plastic baby doll hands.
Midway through the year, I kind of had gotten a sense for what people, like what was going to get the most comments on the blog, or like what people were going to respond to or what was going to get reposted elsewhere. So I had a feeling that people would like the baby doll hands. But so anyway, so I spent the year photographing all this stuff, and I photographed everything on a white background, sort of in an imaginary grid, so that everything was very orderly looking.
Right.
And on about one day every 2 to 3 weeks, I also drew a picture of an imaginary collection, and that was both to let myself off the hook for having 365 actual
it's like,
collections.
You hear 12 aliens.
Yeah. And also just to sort of infuse some of my artwork into the project. And, of course, everything that I photographed had to be small enough to fit on, a piece of paper. I do have some collections at home that didn't go into the project because they're big things. But it was really a great experience, and once I knew that people were paying attention, I knew I couldn't quit halfway through. So that
you're like, I committed to a year.
Yeah, and it was really hard, but I did it, and then a book came out of it, which I'm really proud of, and so it ended up being, great. And then this year I took a break in 2011, but this past year I've worked on another internet project.
So you mentioned that you love things that are really old, things that are vintage. Why? Do you know, or is it a sense? Like, what is it that draws you to that?
I don't know if it's like, and I think this is probably true for a lot of people out there who are drawn to old things. I don't know, there's a sense of nostalgia or beauty. I don't know if I can describe it beyond that when things are sort of frayed or old or worn or have this brown patina to them, that there's something about that that's really beautiful to me. I also think that there are so many things that existed even 20 years ago, which isn't that old, right, that don't exist anymore. And processes for printing things that existed then that don't exist now. Like I said, like vintage typography and design that I'm really drawn to. Things that are handmade or made, before there was even plastic, for example. That are made out of paper.
There was a time where there wasn't plastic. Really?
Yeah, I know, right?
I've heard about that.
I know.
I didn't think it was true.
So I think those are some of the reasons. There's probably reasons that I'm not thinking of, and I also just think it's just an aesthetic that I'm drawn to.
Yeah,
and I started off using a lot of old things in my artwork. So in the early days when I was making a lot of collage, I would use a lot of vintage paper. I would make three-dimensional shadow boxes that had even some vintage objects in them. So I started using the stuff that I was drawn to in my work, and then some of it I just kept, and it's in pristine condition because I couldn't manage to even think of cutting it up.
To keep it just the way it
exactly.
is. It must be preserved.
Yes.
There is something magical about stuff that it's funny, when I look at some stuff that's been around for a long time, I wonder to myself, it's almost like, what has this quarter seen in its life?
Yeah.
Like this picture is hanging on a wall of somebody, in 1903 or whatever it was.
Yeah.
Like, who was in the room? What was, what is this thing experienced in the world? Where's it been in the world that I haven't been? It's like, this item is more traveled than I am. It's a sense of intrigue about what the past was around us.
What's the story? And there are people out there who actually find stuff, boxes of letters and photographs, and try to reconstruct histories. I mean, that's just, I don't have the patience for that, but that's like incredibly fascinating to me.
Yeah, no, that's really neat stuff. So you blend this interest in sort of vintage stuff and old stuff and collections, but I mean, you seem to just sort of be creating on multiple levels these days, like from digital to paint to illustration. And some of the things that I was exposed to also was another project. And I get the feeling also you're very project-based, so the hand lettering was this interesting commitment too. Tell me a little bit about what that is and how that came to life also.
I think after doing the collection a day during 2010, I needed to take a break, but I was, people would ask me like, do you think you'll ever do a project again, a yearly project? And I was like, at the time I was like, I don't know, that was a huge commitment.
No.
I wasn't getting up every morning and taking a photo, I would photograph several in one day and then post them. But slowly as time passed, I was like, I think I'm ready for another project, and I think I'm going to do a new project in 2012. And of course, I told my partner this, who lived through collection a day,
Right.
and me, sort of scrambling to get that done every day, and she was like, "Oh, really?"
It's like, remember,
Okay.
it's both of us
Yeah,
living
and I said,
through
"But
that.
look what happened," and so I decided that this year my project was going to be sort of get really good at, or at least develop my own style of hand lettering. And the way to do that was to post something hand lettered every single day. And it started off actually as a desire to learn and practice calligraphy, like a way to force myself to learn traditional calligraphy that you use ink and a
Right,
nib.
yeah.
And I quickly, within a month, realized that I hated calligraphy and that I hated using a nib, but that I could turn this project into whatever I wanted. It was my
Right.
thing, and
Had you announced that this was going to be calligraphy? Or
no. I mean,
I
I think I may have written a little bit about that being my desire, and that those were some of the supplies that I used. But I think I even wrote a blog post, a few months in after I'd figured this out, and explained to people that one of the learning processes in doing something every single day and posting it on the internet is that you figure out what you like and don't like. Like you learn a lot about yourself and what your preferences are. And what I realized is that I much preferred working with a micron, which is like a nice
Right, a really fine tip,
ink
yeah.
pen, and that I liked sort of playing around with lettering. And some of it, times it was going to be script, and sometimes it was going to be printed, and that in the process of doing something every day, you sort of develop your own style or set of styles. And I started in earnest, like everything was pretty mishmash the first few months, but in May, I started pretty much posting quotes every day. I just found myself going to either, a few times it was poetry, but for the most part I was just like, okay, what am I going to hand letter today? And then I was just drawn to quotes. Sometimes they're inspiring, sometimes enlightening, sometimes kind of dark. It's not like they were all affirmations, but they were something that I thought was interesting or inspiring. And then shortly thereafter, it was like that was just what happened, is that almost every day, with some exceptions, I was hand lettering and illustrating quotations in various styles, and more I was sort of scanning them and coloring them in Photoshop and
Right.
making them more beautiful and interesting. And I started spending more time every morning hand lettering, and a lot has come of it too. Like I've started to get some hand lettering work now, and a book is also being published of 100 of the quotes.
Oh,
So
that's
it led to
amazing.
another book. Yeah. So lots of really
So
cool.
I'm seeing a pattern.
Yeah.
Start with a collection
idea.
and then
Yeah.
do it every
Yeah.
day, and it turns into a book.
Yeah, exactly. I've also gotten much better. Anytime you do anything, you practice anything over and over and over, you get better at it.
Yeah.
It's just what happens. So.
But this is so fascinating to me, right? Because so many people would say, okay, I want to do all the practice before I go public with
Yes.
this. So I don't want to do this in plain view. And you're like, no, I'm starting where I am, and I'm going public with where I am. And I may be great in the beginning, I may suck in the beginning, but you're all going to see it. You're going to see the evolution.
A lot of my stuff did suck in the beginning. In fact, even with my collections project, some of my photographs were so horrible because I was too dark and I didn't have the right lighting. It's like, even in that project where it was less about my artwork, I learned over time what I should be doing differently to take good photographs. So, and in some cases, like, it's slightly embarrassing to look back on my own work, whether it's from this project or even stuff I did 5 years ago.
Stuff I've written
when
a couple years ago.
like you can't even look at it
Right.
anymore. But the thing about the internet, I feel like, is pretty forgiving. People mostly pay attention to what you're currently doing. And I guess I'm the kind of person that, like, isn't afraid to put myself out there a little bit. I think maybe it's because I came into art making when I was a bit older. I didn't even start drawing or painting until I was 30. I'm in my mid-40s now. So it's like, I think that somewhere along the way, I stopped worrying about, I still worry about what other people are going to think. Believe me, I'm human.
Right.
But I stopped worrying as much about that and about being perfect. And actually, the whole way I got to do, part of how I got to do what I'm doing now is that I started posting pictures of my work very early on. Those same pictures that I can't look at anymore were actually what got me where I am, because unless you are willing to sort of take some risks and put yourself out there for other people to see and respond to, it's difficult to move. Like if we are always waiting for things to be perfect, we'll
wait forever.
We'll wait forever, right? Because it's never going to be perfect. So that's, I think, part of where I come from.
It's just, but it's so fascinating to me because there's so many people. I wonder how much the world is not getting, how much we're not getting to see, to hear, to taste, to smell.
Right.
You know, beauty, how much genius. Simply because people aren't willing to go public with their imperfect selves and processes. You know, and it's certainly something I struggle with.
Yes.
You know, when I was a kid, I was a painter. And I would steal away, you know, in the corner of a basement under a swing arm light for days and paint something. And then after a couple of weeks, if I didn't feel it was perfect, done.
Right.
You know, I would just trash it and start over. And it's interesting. Like I wonder if the ease of the creative process and maybe the ease of getting it out there with technology, on the one way, it facilitates you just getting things out and iterating and getting feedback and getting more comfortable with the fact that people are going to see and comment on your stuff. But the flip side of that is that you have the ability to put stuff out, but everybody has a voice now and you can hear it back from all around the world.
Right.
And that terrifies a lot of people.
I think it does. You know, the tricky thing is that on the one hand, you want to be open enough and sort of willing enough to take risks to put your work out there. Because like we were just saying, unless you put it out there for people to see and respond to, nothing's going to happen with it, right? But at the same time, you also have to curate and edit your own work and like think about, you know, do I really want to put everything out there? I'm still an advocate for putting your best work out there that you possibly can. So there's this balance between being open and taking risks, but also knowing that whatever it is you're putting out is maybe it may not be perfect, but it's the best that you can do then. Because I think if you flood the internet with every single thing you're doing or thinking, it's too much,
not gonna work all that well.
So there's definitely a balance, and I do feel like there's a lot of, you see both sides. You see people who are literally vomiting on the internet, like everything about their personal life and everything, too much information. And then you have people who who don't want to share anything. And how many of those people have talents, whether they're visual or, you know, or you know, like ideas that we'll never know because they're so afraid that somebody's going to criticize them publicly.
I mean, it's interesting too because, you know, I've had this conversation with. There's a strong inner artist in me, and one of my commitments for 2013 is actually to get back to painting and to get back to playing music and just creating with my hands, because when it's in you and you're not doing it, you feel it.
Yes.
You really feel it. One of the things that you brought up was that you came to the art world much later in life than maybe your average person who, like, the world anoints an artist. Tell me a little bit about where you've come from and how this substantial change happened.
It's a way longer story than I can tell you while we're sitting here, but I can summarize it, I think, to say when I grew up, I did not consider myself artistic at all. In fact, my sister, who's 2 years younger than I am, in my view was the artist and the creative one. She's the one who took art classes in high school and was sort of really creative and not just visually. She was a great writer, and I was a spunky kid. I did well in school, but I was pretty athletic, and I didn't really identify as a creative person. And so in my 20s, I was in a relationship with somebody who was an artist. And for the first time, it wasn't as if it was the first time I was exposed to art. I mean, my mother is very creative and is actually came late in her life to being an artist. That's a whole nother story. But she, we definitely were exposed to things as kids, but as an adult, the first time I was really exposed to art and design and all these things that have become really interesting to me and become my life was when I was in my 20s, because I was in a relationship with somebody who was immersed in that world. And so it's like my whole world opened up, and I saw these things that I had never seen and saw them in a different way and through new eyes. So even then, I didn't ever consider it was something that I could do myself. It was just more that it's interesting and beautiful. And slowly but surely, I started getting out the craft and paint supplies, and maybe occasionally I would make some things with my then partner at the kitchen table. And so I definitely dabbled. Fast forward to about 2005, I had been through a really painful ending of a relationship. Not that one. This was another one that had followed it. And found myself in a really, really dark place. And I had taken a few painting classes in years prior to that, and figured out that it was something that I loved to do. Again, I at the time didn't really realize that now, 2012, it's how I make my full living. It's my entire life.
It's just the thing that you're drawn to.
Even in 2005, I started a blog that doesn't exist anymore. I have another blog now, but I started making stuff because I was trying to get myself out of this dark place. And I was doing lots of things to try to get myself out of this dark place. But one of the things I did was got into this, I'd taken some classes, but now I started like painting at home and making stuff and sewing, and it was like a myriad of creative things. I was just exploring. And in the process, I got myself out of the dark place. And then I became prolific. And I really started to figure out what I loved and what I was good at, and people were responding to it. And by 2007, literally 2 years later, it wasn't overnight. 2 years is a long amount of time for something to happen. I got like my first illustration job, and I was in my first show at a gallery, and then in the last 5 years, it's sort of incrementally taken off from there. And I left my job, and
So what were you actually doing to earn a living back then? Before
I was started off as a project manager at a nonprofit. I was a elementary school teacher for several years after I graduated from college, and then I went to work at an education nonprofit that worked in low-income schools in the Bay Area. And I was very passionate about what I did. I loved my colleagues. I loved the work I was doing. But you know how you were saying earlier, like, when you're not making stuff, there's this part of you that aches, right? I didn't even know that's why I was aching. But that's why I was aching. I figured it out now. I was just like kind of miserable and bored in a way, being in an office in a cubicle. And so for a while, I did that and painted and drew and made collage. I sort of led this dual life where I went to work full time during the day and then would come home at night, and on the weekends I would just make stuff constantly. And then eventually it got to the point where I went part-time at my job, and that people I worked with were wonderful and kind of saw this transformation happen and saw that I was so happy doing these things and were very supportive of that transition. So that was great.
So, and you could feel the process literally just shifting the way that you were in the world.
Yes. I mean, it didn't happen overnight. There was nothing there was no aha moment. There was no one pivotal thing that happened. It was more just over time I realized that making things and making art and sharing it with the world was what made me feel fulfilled and gratified, and that I needed to be doing that every day, and I needed to figure out a way to make that happen so that I could do it every day.
Yeah. You also, so the fact that this comes out of a period of intense pain, suffering from you, is such a common theme with so many people that are artists, regardless of the medium, that I'm aware of. And there's this whole, I think, mythology around suffering and pain and art. And some people think you have to go to that place. Some people think you have to live there perpetually to create great art. Some people are like, no, actually my best work, I think it was Ray Bradbury who said, I go to work happy and peppy every day, basically. I love to do stuff. It's not pain, it's not hard. Talk to me about your experience of the relationship between pain, suffering, and art.
Well, it's interesting. I've been pretty prolific in the last, say, 5 years, since about 2007. And I've made a lot of work. And as a normal human being, I have bad days and I have good days. And fortunately, I've had no, terrible days, or haven't gone through anything traumatic or super dark in the last 5 years. And I would say most days I feel pretty happy. But for me, making art comes from like the fullness of who we are as humans, and that we feel pain and sadness, and we also feel happiness and elation and joy, and that having a space for all of that to be part of who you are, or at least part of your experience, is what gets me to the place where I can actually sit down and be creative, right? Because if I'm fighting what's inside of me, whether some people fight joy, right? Because they don't feel like they deserve to be joyful. Some people fight sadness because they don't want to be sad. But anytime you're having a battle internally about your feelings, it's really hard to actually make work. You might have creative ideas, but to sit down and actually have something move forward is really difficult. And so I think for me, it's not about necessarily whether I'm happy or sad that makes me make good work. It's just like having, like, holding space for all of that inside of myself, so that I can go to the studio even on a bad day when I have like a huge deadline or something, that I can make work, and that it can be, I can focus. Because really what makes me have good work is my ability to like focus on being detailed and like getting the right composition and getting the right colors, and because I don't want to be blocked, right? So so I gotta be open, and part of that is just like, being in a place where you just let yourself be whatever you are that day.
Yeah, it's so interesting to really explore the dynamic of emotion, high and low, and how that affects people's ability to create. And to me, it's almost like you got to fully engage with life. Right. But when you're in the darkest parts, and we all have highs and we all have lows, if you're really there, you don't skate through in the gray zone, and it's not a place that I want to skate through. Right. But I've never been able to actually really create when I'm in the low place. Yes. It creates data, creates like the raw material for some really interesting stuff. But to me, that's not a place where things become manifest in the world. Well, what happens when you're in a dark place or a low place or even a gray place is that there's very little motivation to actually make stuff or to do stuff, or very little hope about it looking, the way you want it to look in the end. So it's really hard to actually focus and concentrate and get motivated to make art when you're in the gray place. And that's hard, So being in a place where you're feeling good about your work and confident about your ability to execute your next idea is important, especially if you're in the business of making art for a living. So I do feel like, of course, being happier is better when you're an artist. But I do also think that we gotta, draw from all these different parts of ourselves to make what we make every day. And my work changes, and the mood of my work changes depending on sort of where I am and what's inspiring me at the moment. Because sometimes things that inspire me are really dark and barren and awful, So with your hand lettering, will the day's choice sort of reflect sometimes where you are? Yeah, sometimes I might also choose a more uplifting quote to hand letter. Almost a counter. Sometimes if I'm feeling particularly nostalgic about something or emotional about something, I will choose a quote that
resonates for me that day. So, I mean, a lot of our great thinkers from the past were not always like super positive about life.
But that's the mythology, especially with writers.
Right.
I mean, there's there's that archetype of just the miserable like alcoholic writer
Right.
who just has to be in that place, and that's where all the terrible things in life happen, but the greatest work happens, and it doesn't feel right for me. And everyone's got to have their own truth. So I would never deign to say what's right or wrong for anybody else, but for me, it just never felt like that's what I needed to do, or that's maybe that's what something great came out of it for someone else.
Right.
I've never felt like I had to go to that place,
right.
Or put myself there.
Yes.
I think I know some people that very deliberately, they have good lives.
Yeah.
They do good work. They could wake up happy, but they choose not to because they're terrified that if they do, the good work is going to stop coming out of them.
Right. It's true. It's almost like when you keep when you're in that process of dating people, and you keep choosing people who are mean to you or
right.
emotionally absent or whatever, because you think that you're not going to have any passion if you're with somebody who's good to you.
Yeah, there must be something
it's
in
like
our
the same
genetics.
things.
We just programmed to keep hitting ourselves.
Exactly. We're all like
right.
that. It's true. It's part of human nature, I think.
Right. So you mentioned when you're in the business of making art, you have a real business. I mean, you have a livelihood, you have different ventures, you have books, you have products, and you're working on, I know, a number of cool new products. This is another area for artists where there are a lot of strong mixed feelings about blending the two. Tell me a little bit about your exploration of that.
I didn't go through traditional channels to become an artist. I sort of became one on my own. And what I learned was that there's this division oftentimes between commercial artists and fine artists, so that you're either, I don't think this is completely true writ large, I don't think that everybody believes this, but there are many people out there, or the messages that, there are many people who believe or give in some way, shape, or form the message that if you're an illustrator or a graphic designer or whatever, you're a commercial artist, and that
it's not real art.
Well, yes, perhaps A, that, and B, that there is just while that's an okay way to make a living, that people who are fine artists and sort of create their own personal work and don't make work for clients, don't get art direction, right? They only take art direction from themselves.
Right.
That somehow their work is purer, or that they sort of, the one way for them to make a living is to sell their work in galleries and to have people buy their original work, and that there's no, there's very little crossover. If you're a fine artist, you aren't an illustrator. If you're an illustrator, you're not a fine artist. I think that those lines are starting to get blurred now. I think traditionally that's how it's been in the art world, and for a lot of people it probably still is. My life right now is mostly illustration, and which is, if you get a good roster of clients, a decent way to make a living. And for a lot of folks, who are just making fine art, don't want to sell out, right? Don't want to do commercial work. They're just waiting for the next break, who's going to buy my painting, right? And so their income can be pretty stagnant. And I found myself in that position in the beginning, how am I ever going to do this? If I'm just a fine artist and I'm just making paintings that I want to make, how am I going to make a living? How am I going to do this?
I don't have power.
Right. Right. I'm just waiting for somebody to come, or I have to wait till I can sign with this prestigious gallery, and that could be 20 years from now.
That could never be me.
Well, and for me, I was okay, I love this so much. I love doing this. How can I make this work for me? And I figured out that illustration was one way that could work for me. Now, one of the differences between illustration and just being a pure fine artist is that you're working for a client. Somebody else is telling you what to do. Sometimes your work goes on a product, or in a newspaper, or on a book cover, and a lot of people don't want to do that because they want their work to be purely their own and not be sort of contaminated by any of that. I got over that really fast because I found that I love doing illustration. I've sort of fallen into book illustration as sort of mostly what I do now. And I do some surface design and fabric and wallpaper, and so I've figured out a way to make illustration work for me, like by taking jobs that feel really aligned with, my moral compass and my like personal aesthetic. And so I think that if you're an artist who, wants to experiment with making money in different ways, illustration is great. But I would say stay authentic to who you are and to what your style is. Don't ever take a job that you feel like, isn't you or isn't for you. I also sell prints of my work. A lot of people don't want to do that, and I think that that's fine, but it is another source of income that works well for me. So for me, the way that I've sort of gotten to the place where I can do this for a living is by diversifying my sources of income in different ways. Like I do still sell original paintings. I do occasionally sell my work in galleries. I'm still part of shows. I also do a lot of illustration work. I take fine art commissions, so people pay me to make paintings for them, family portraits, dog portraits, whatever. And I also sell prints of my work. So I figured out a way to like make a living through all of these different channels that add up to what is a full-time income. Yeah. And not everybody can do that, and that doesn't necessarily feel right to everyone, but I think that if you can figure out a way to make it work for you if you're an artist, it is possible.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because there's conversations I've had, I'm sure you've had so many more than I on this. It's sort of like I need to be true to my muse. That means it can't be bastardized in any way by input from anybody else. It's got to come out of me because I'm doing this. And my thought has always been, if you're doing this because this is the thing you can't not do and you just have to do it, and it has to be the purest expression of who you are, and that's the approach that you want to take, do it. But also own the fact that you may also always have to wait tables or work a full-time job or something like that, and that's okay. That's the trade-off I'm making to be willing to be absolutely 100% true to myself. But the moment that you become interested or seek somebody else to trade value for what you're creating, whether you want what they have to say to matter or not, it does.
Yes.
And that's the thing, the toughest pill for a lot of people to swallow.
Yeah, I agree. It's still hard for me. Like, I have to consider I don't say yes to every job. Yeah. And sometimes it's because it doesn't feel aligned with either, like, I look at the company and what they do and I say, I don't want my name attached to that company. Right. Or, they want me to, I'm a vegetarian. They want me to illustrate a meat cookbook. I'm not going to do that. Like, there are just little things sometimes that cause me to turn a job down. They're not huge deals. They're not huge moral dilemmas. They're just like, that doesn't feel right to me. I'm in a position now where I can do that because I have a steady stream of work coming in. And I realize that for a lot of folks starting out, like, saying yes to everything that comes your way feels important too. So there are some sacrifices that you may have to make in the beginning. But I feel like I was experimenting with taking a lot of jobs and doing whatever I could to sort of make a living making art, because that's what I wanted to do all the time. I didn't want to have a job. I didn't want to wait tables. I didn't even want to teach for that matter. And so I learned in the beginning that not everything felt good that I was doing. And I've, over the last few years, figured out, like, there are just certain things that I don't do anymore and things that I say no to because they don't feel right. And inevitably, it's been scary, right? Because it's hard saying no to something that could potentially put money in your wallet. But at the same, because as a freelance artist, you never know it's not like getting a regular paycheck, right? You never know what's going to happen next. And so there's a lot of trust involved that if I do the right thing for me and I say yes to the stuff that feels right to me and no to the stuff that doesn't, that more and more of the right stuff is going to come along and less of the stuff. And it happens that way. Well, at least it happened that way for me. And like inevitably those gaps that were created by saying no to things got filled very quickly by stuff that felt good.
Yeah, sort of the role of faith.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's sort of how it started to happen for me. And I think we need to trust our inner voice that, you know, if something doesn't feel good, the work's not going to be very good. We're going to be ashamed of it. We're not going to want to put it in our portfolio anyway. We're not going to even feel good about getting the check when it finally comes. So.
Yeah, and I think that's such a powerful reminder also. And it's not just for art.
Right. Or anything.
That's everything.
Everything.
You know, it's like if it doesn't feel right. I think so many people we've so tuned out that gut check, that sense of intuition.
Yeah.
Because we kind of all know when it's right and when it's not. But we've just so gotten into the habit of not listening.
Right.
Part of my practice, you know, as I live, is to try and really keep reminding myself, tuning into it and listening to it. It's not always easy. And the further you get into life, the more responsibilities you have, the more tempted you can become.
Yeah.
To kind of like say, oh, but that could make me really comfortable financially for a while if I do it, even though you know deep down that it's going to empty you out with every day that you're doing it. So it's a balancing act.
It's true. And I think that I'm continually experimenting with saying yes to things that I'm not sure about.
Yeah.
So it's not like it's ever like one day you no longer say yes.
Right.
Like you may actually say yes to a way to, you know, make money from your art that might feel good in the beginning and ends up feeling terrible at the end, and you learn from that.
Or vice versa.
Or vice versa.
Yeah.
And so I think it's just like, that's what life is. Like you experiment with stuff and you try to figure some stuff out, and then hopefully you learn from it. And so, you know, doing commercial work isn't for every artist, either because it isn't part of like their definition of who they are. It doesn't make them feel good. They really only want to listen to their own sort of inner voice about what they should be making and doing. And I applaud those people, for that group of people, for being authentic. I think for some of us, the way in this day and age that we've been able to make a living making art is by like selling it in new and interesting ways, or being illustrators, or opening an online shop and selling your work online, or whatever. Like there are ways to make it happen, and that feels okay to me, and that's important. That's
your truth.
Yeah.
This has been so much fun. One of the things I always like to sort of circle back to is the namesake of this project, which is a good life project, and explore, when I offer that term, to live a good life. What comes up for you? What does it mean to you?
I think that like the main thing that I sort of figured out in the last 5 years, that I think have been the sort of the richest time of my life, and by that I don't mean monetarily, I mean like the last 5 years of my life. Incidentally, I turned 45 in less than a month, and around the time I turned 40 was when I started really like making a lot of changes in my life, and sort of getting up every day and doing what I loved and trying to make it my living, right? And what I've figured out is that like the extent to which I can stay true to myself, like live an authentic life, like make the work that I want to make in ways that feel good to me, work with clients that feel like good clients, and do projects and, write stories on my blog that feel good. That's sort of what makes me, feel like I'm living a good life. It's like just staying authentic to me and not trying to be anybody who I'm not trying to make my art like somebody else's, not beating myself up because I'm comparing myself to people who might, have achieved different things than I have, or in my mind more than I have. Just being like, this is my life, this is my experience, and I'm going to get up every day and try to make it, as awesome as I can. And that's, to me, like what living a good life is, just doing what you love and being who you are and not apologizing for it, I guess.
I love that. No, that's great. Thank you for sharing that with me. I appreciate it. So I so enjoyed the conversation. Thanks for setting aside a bit of time today to hang out in this amazing creative hive of energy.
Thank you. It's been great.
Thank you. My name is Jonathan Fields. My guest today has been Lisa Condon, artist, illustrator, and innovator, creator, and it's been my pleasure. So signing off for Good Life Project.